Hello everyone, welcome back to the Nicomachean Ethics, still in book 6, and we're going to be finishing it up by looking at chapters 9 and 10 in this video, and then to finish it up from 11 to 13 in next video. But this section of it, namely the chapters 9 to 12, Aristotle is dealing with what one could call the minor intellectual virtues. The major intellectual virtues, remember those 5 ways of grasping the truth, where we talked about techne and episteme and phronesis and nous, and of course Sophia. So we have those 5 modes. Well, these minor ones, so the 5 major ones, the 4 minor ones, are what you could say, to follow one of the great commentators on Aristotle, namely St. Thomas Aquinas. So it's always good to look at Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle. And he says that think of these virtues here, these intellectual virtues in chapters 9 to 12 as annexed to phronesis. So they're like subsidiary, supportive of intellectual virtues for phronesis. And I would maintain that's a good way to think of it, because Aristotle slides back and forth, and even sometimes he'll use phronesis as more of a catch-all term, which seems to include some of these minor virtues. So Aristotle's doing a lot of, shall we say, moral psychology, really trying to pull apart all the different machinations of the mind when it's thinking about thinking in a practical reason type format. So phronesis may not be quite as specific, like when it's said in the text, it might be a little bit broader than we've normally come to think of it. So Aristotle slides a bit back and forth, and I think that sort of slipperiness, shall we call it, in the text is another indicator, we could say, that the Nicomachean Ethics is a raw piece of work. It's got lots of great ideas, and it's pretty well organized. Not perfect. There's parts of it that I've pointed out that are problematic. But by and large, the Nicomachean Ethics could use a good editor, and I'm sure that if we had the more polished version, some of the distinctions that Aristotle makes here would be clearer. But nonetheless, I think we can sit back and admire the level of investigation that Aristotle goes into when he thinks about and analyzes how we think when we're thinking morally, when we're doing practical reason, and in other words, when we're undergoing phronesis. So, in this chapter, that is, I'm now working in chapter 9. So in chapter 9, Aristotle returns to an old topic, namely eubulia, and you can think of that as, we discussed it already. Deliberation, right? Way back in book 3, when he's talking about choice and deliberation and all that stuff. Back there, if you go back, if you're not familiar with it, go back and watch the video on that deal with eubulia, deliberation, and choice, and all that stuff in book 3. Remember, Aristotle was talking about what do we deliberate about. So deliberation shouldn't be equated with thought and thinking in general. Remember, Aristotle is always introducing technical terminology. And so deliberation was a certain kind of thought. You don't deliberate about just anything. For instance, you don't deliberate on an issue that's impossible. For instance, you don't deliberate about, like I wouldn't be able to deliberate, using Aristotle's language, about flapping my arms and flying around the room. If I were to think about that, that would be an act of imagination. That would not be the mental act of deliberation. Same thing when Aristotle talks about eternal objects. A mathematician does not deliberate about mathematics. A mathematician, she would be using episteme, nous, to put things together, to do proofs and all that stuff, but that wouldn't be the same as deliberation. Deliberation involves objects that are within our power, truths that are not eternal, truths that relate to us. So keep that in mind. So Aristotle now is more concerned about the nature of eubulia, deliberation, rather than its scope. So he starts off with its scope. And he, of course, as we saw earlier, he links eubulia to the moral virtues. and in a sense of having to complete them. But eubulia actually turns out to be one of the intellectual virtues. But remember, all these virtues have to fit together in order to have a virtuous person, because at the end of the day, what's a person? A person is a combination of desires, passions, and reason. Right. So Aristotle now says, okay, let's dive a little deeper into the nature of eubulia. What exactly what's so great about it? What is the excellence of it? What is good eubulia? What does it look like? And he compares it with a few things. He says, is it like knowledge? Is it like belief? Is it like skill and conjecture? And basically the answer to all of these is no. It's not like knowledge, not like belief, not like conjecture. And in knowledge, like as in scientific demonstration, no, eubulia is a lot like inquiry. It's not identical, but it's a lot like inquiry. And you don't inquire into things that you know. There's a certain kind of, shall we say, a correctness and incorrectness. That's important for Aristotle. That eubulia can kind of miss the mark or get the mark, and there's a certain correctness to it. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, as I point out here. Correctness, what's that? Well, there's going to be different types. But there's no correctness when it comes to episteme. You don't just partly get the demonstration right or wrong. It's completely correct, or it's not episteme. Right? Remember, it's having the truth and moving from eternal truths via logic to eternal truths. Nous comes in, grasps, episteme moves, but you're always within the realm of these truths. There's no such thing as an incorrectness in science or scientific demonstration, that is, with episteme. Is it like belief or opinion? So is eubulia like a belief or opinion? Aristotle says it's somewhat like that. But what's a belief? Well, remember, beliefs have certain relationships to truth. They, like eubulia, do not actually have truth, but they may have an accidental relationship to truth. And if you're not sure what I meant by that, I have talked about this in previous videos. But the accidental relationship is where you might utter something and you really aren't sure of it. You just believe it. And then lo and behold, it turns out that what you said was true, but you wouldn't be able to say, well, at the time of uttering that statement, I was certain of it. No, it was just a lucky guess, and you believed that you were right, and you were lucky that you were right. So belief is like taking a position, an affirmation. And taking a position and affirmation, that's not really eubulia, because eubulia is, remember, translated roughly as deliberation. So when you're deliberating, you're not taking a position. You're deliberating. You're thinking about variable truths. You're thinking about things that come into existence. You're not taking a particular stand. Having a belief is to take some kind of stand. You may change your mind or whatever afterwards, or you may say, you may qualify by saying, well, I'm not absolutely wed to the belief, but nonetheless, you're still taking a kind of stand, and that's what distinguishes belief from eubulia. Well, is it skill and conjecture, a capacity to guess? Well, Aristotle says no, it's not like that. It's something more, because this capacity and conjecture and this skill is quick, without reasoned argument, and we say somebody's a good guesser, and some people can be fairly good at that. They can be guessing, and they tend to have higher than statistical odds, right? Sometimes you can just guess, and statistically you'll have a certain percentage of chance or whatever of getting it right. Some people seem to be pretty good at guessing. Fine, but Aristotle says, nah, that's not really deliberation. Deliberation tends to be kind of slow, but not too slow. But not too fast. It's kind of like the just right, sort of the Goldilocks way of thinking. And acting comes after deliberation, yes, but and acting quickly follows deliberation, but deliberation is not something that you really tend to do quickly. So it involves thorough reasoning and calculation, and skill and conjecture, like guesswork, doesn't really involve that. So, okay, he's trying to pull eubulia away from these kinds of things. And as I mentioned, with knowledge, it's absolutely correct. There's no degrees of correctness in it, belief can have degrees of correctness. So Aristotle picks up on this notion of correctness. It could, what is it a certain kind of correctness? In, what's the particular, what's so great, or what's the good or the excellence of eubulia seems to be linked with this notion of correctness. And not surprising with Aristotle, whenever you sort of think you have a species, it turns out to be a genus. In other words, there's different species or different types of correctness. And he gives a little discussion of a number of them. And he gives us some scenarios. He says, well, let's think about certain ways in which we do things. The first one here, which I've talked about a little, which I've written down as the lack of self-control. That's the first one that he talks about. So suppose someone lacks self-control, but they set forth, they lack self-control, and they set forth bad goals, right? Bad things they want to achieve. But after using their eubulia, right, after deliberation, they managed to achieve their goals that they set. But remember, these goals were sort of randomly, without self-control, they were set, and perhaps this person who lacks self-control was pretty good at logic. So their eubulia was pretty good, but they end up achieving something bad, right? So doing something bad, or some kind of goal that's, we would say, oh, yeah, you did it well, but, that's not a good thing to have done. So this kind of correctness with eubulia is not the right kind of correctness, because it leads to something bad. And the correctness that we want with eubulia, it's not to be confused with just getting something right. There's a certain moral tinge to it. So the correctness that's associated with the excellence of eubulia is got to be leading to something good. A way to understand what Aristotle's not talking about here, it's, let's say if someone is a smart thief, right? Someone who is an intelligent crook, who is really smart at figuring out how to do bad things, then Aristotle would say, well, there's a correctness to their eubulia. They can deliberate and figure things out, but it's not the excellence of eubulia that Aristotle is interested in, because it should lead to something that is good. It's moral. It's not leading to better crimes or things like that. So again, he's contrasting this like the smart thief. No, that's eubulia, but not excellent eubulia, not the right kind of eubulia or the right kind of correctness. Well, think about the second one, and I label this the illogical one. In this case, you could have a person, and we see this all the time, a person who, let's say, sets forth a good goal, right? And this theme actually is explored a lot in literature. If you read, if you're to reading novels and plays, this is the case where someone, through deliberation, like they're thinking about something and wondering about it, they set forth maybe a good goal. They want to do something proper, but their reasoning about it is poor. Their reasoning about it could be illogical. Aristotle refers to his own philosophical views on logic when he talks about, getting the premises wrong and doing the wrong syllogism, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into the logic of it, but basically a flawed kind of reasoning that one could employ, but they get to the right target. They get there. So in this sense, you do something kind of illogical, but you get to the right end. But you get to the right end in the wrong way. So in that sense, it differs from this. It's getting maybe to the wrong end in a good way, which doesn't quite meet the excellence of eubulia that Aristotle wants. This one is getting to a good end in the wrong way. Now you might think, oh, well, what's so bad about that? Well, Aristotle's more concerned with things that where kind of an end, you can think of the ends justify the means type reasoning, where, well, if I have a good goal that I'm after, and we hear this a lot if in military ethics, for instance, if you're interested in having a certain kind of mission fulfilled, there are ways you could do it, but we might say, oh, wow, there's ways that we would not accept as proper ways of reasoning to go to get the end. We might say you can't go to get a good end by, causing all kinds of collateral damage, for instance. So in this sense, it's the bad way to get to a good end, or the illogical way to get to the good end, as Aristotle says. But it's mostly trying to avoid that ends justify the means. So even though you have a good, telos, it doesn't mean you can just get there any way you wish. So the correctness is not just the correctness of the end, but it's the correctness of how you get to that end in terms of the excellence of eubulia. And last, in this sense, eubulia, because it's linked, remember, eubulia is the deliberation, and then afterwards comes the action, or the praxis, to use Aristotle's word. For the praxis, that comes right after the eubulia. Now, the action, of course, in order to be efficient, in order to be proper, in order for it to be good action in the full sense of the term, it can't just happen at any old time, Aristotle says. So someone who's excellent at deliberating, again, their correctness will not just be getting to a good goal, getting there in the right way. You got to get to the good goal, you got to get there in the right way, and you have to get there on time. So there's a punctuality aspect. There's a temporal dimension to eubulia, is not too hasty and not too tardy. So not too fast, so not too fast or too slow. As I say, Goldilocks, your timing is just right. That's excellence in eubulia, excellence in this kind of deliberation. And remember, this is closely linked to phronesis, right? This isn't talking about abstract structures and things like that. This is about truths that we make that are temporal, and they're concerned with our actions and our human ends, praxis, not techne, right, in making pottery or things like that. That's not what we're talking about. So you always got to keep this terminology straight. So again, we're talking about, in these chapters, the minor intellectual virtues that are annexed to phronesis. So we're talking about virtues that are close to phronesis, that maybe require and feed into phronesis, but they're not to be identified with phronesis, but they're certainly not to be identified with techne or other things. So deliberation is kind of a good way of inquiry. It's not just any old inquiry, but it resembles inquiry. All right. Now, Aristotle ends with a last little reflection on it, that there is sort of the eubulia of the excellence about the eubulia in life, about general things, sort of the unqualified, that you're good at deliberating in general without looking at particular situations. He doesn't really say too much about it, but he also says that in addition to that, there's the eubulia with particular things. So you can think of it as the unqualified, the broad eubulia, the qualified, the narrower eubulia, and or the limited, or unlimited, and the limited. Broad and the narrow, if you like. But he doesn't really go into any details or examples. So eubulia is kind of starting the process off. It's deliberating about these things. In chapter 10, talks about synesis. All right, so chapter 9, eubulia. I want to move now to chapter 10 with synesis. All right, these aren't the same letter here. I'll make that a little bit clearer. Synesis. All right, that's an upsilon there. And in this sense now, what's the relationship between synesis and phronesis? All right, so there's a little bit of poetry there. And in this case now, Aristotle wants to try and show that they have a relationship, kind of a comparison and contrast. And again, if you check out Aquinas' commentary is very good for a number of reasons, in addition to just explaining what Aristotle's doing. But Aquinas, in his commentary, also tells you sort of like in little inserts that, well, this is what Aristotle's up to now, and then you can read Aristotle's passage, and this is where he's going, and this is why he does this, and then you read Aristotle's passages, and then Aquinas will give his commentary afterwards. So it can be quite helpful. It's not perfect, but by and large, it can be quite helpful, especially if you're not used to reading Aristotle. All right, back to chapter 10. Synesis and phronesis. How are they the same? Well, like phronesis, Sinis and Phanesis, so they both deal, okay, so both deal with temporal truths. Right? So they're both deal with temporal truths. Sets, variable things, but they deal with a subset of variable things. Remember, these are the things that we bring into existence, right? So what we bring into existence, right? But it's not, right, in the term of as we talked about earlier, it's not techne. Oops, techne. Hang on, let me clean that up a bit. Not techne. Rather, it's through what I called praxis. And remember, praxis. Right, so it's praxis. And remember, that's really action. Oh, now I'm losing my English. Action. So this is a subset of the variable truths, what we bring into existence, but not through our techne, but through praxis. So they're concerned with the same things, but they're not to be identified. What's the difference? Well, Sinis, well, let me go back to Phanesis again. Phanesis, shall we say, oh, I'm going to get a little messy here, but Phanesis, remember, the key thing that's important about it is Phanesis ultimately issues commands. Right? Phanesis doesn't simply make judgments. It says what you should do. It's got that ought built in. So it, shall we say, it's the locus of, or at least part of the story, as to where we get this sense of ought from, where reason is saying not just what is the case or what could be the case, but it's saying what should be the case, what you should be doing. So it provides us with a command, what we should do, but Sinis really just supplies judgments. And those are various ways that you can think of as judgments, because judgments are, in the history of philosophy, they've been unpacked in a variety of ways as mental states and propositions and all kinds of things. But judgments are a way of unifying things, making unities, making meaning, making sense out of things. And in this sense, Sinis is this basic sort of mode of coming up with judgments that are really the result ultimately that tie back into eubolia. So eubolia kind of feeds into Sinis. Now, are these really all that distinct, these mental processes? Well, if you go and you look at Aristotle, which I'm not going to do in this course, but if you look at De Anima, on the soul, Aristotle does admit in places that a lot of the distinctions he makes are for pedagogical purposes, that you shouldn't think that there's actually really these complete separate parts that you can point to, like pieces of a pizza pie or something like that, and go, well, that's that separate piece and that's that. So even in the whole mental process of going through eubolia and Sinis and onto Phanesis, and there's even more parts, there may not be really a clear and fast distinction. So it could be things more of emphasis. Nonetheless, in order to come to some kind of command, what you ought to do, right, there has to be some kind of judgment made in some sense. And this is more of a judgment as a neutral point. So to put what we have together, you have eubolia kind of starting the process, and Sinis kind of picking it up and coming to some kind of conclusion, and then Phanesis giving a command. But on the other hand, we do sometimes say, when we talk about certain people as having pretty good judgment or a pretty good, a good sense of things, and having a good sense of things, Aristotle is even going to subdivide that, right? But having a good sort of awareness and sense of things and pretty good judgment, that could be someone that we say, who doesn't necessarily feel they have to act on it, would say that someone who has Sinis but not phronesis, right? They don't really, they go, yeah, that's how things are, but I'm not really saying you should do that or do anything about it. So that's lacking the sort of the, shall we say, the capstone of command, right? Or feeling that you should do something, or thinking that reason is telling you should do something, but just leaving reason at the level of kind of a judgment. So we've got now a couple of terms in here for chapter 9 and 10. So we've got eubulia, which is this process of thinking, synesis, which is this process of coming to a kind of judgment. It's all leading up to the big thing of phronesis. But there's a couple other things that we have to look at in terms of these minor intellectual virtues. There's 2 more of these things. Stay tuned for that on another video.